So in addition to these temporal patterns that we looked at in the priestly visualization that Molly has explained to you, we're also sort of messing around with ways to look at things spatially as well, so a different dimension. So say, for instance, I'm interested in Richard Colhor. He's an archaeologist, I'm an archaeologist. He traveled in Italy in the 18th century. I could look at his dictionary entry at Ingemel's, but if I'm interested in sort of seeing the spatial extent of his tour on a map, I can now do that with our other visualization that we've been building. So this map of Italy shows these gray dots. Each gray dot is one place that Ingemel's mentions a grand tour went in the 18th century. I'm interested in Richard Colhor. So just like in the priestly visualization, I can search for anyone I want to. I type in Colhor. The visualization highlights each place that Colhor visited in red. So now I can sort of see where he went in one sort of powerful moment. But beyond just sort of seeing the pattern of one person's visits, I can also sort of interact with this. I see here that Richard Colhor went to Sicily. I know from reading Colhor's journals that he left behind that not only did he go to Sicily, but he traveled all around Sicily and tells us, you know, the order of his places and the individual places that he stopped. On the other hand, Ingemel's only mentions that Richard Colhor went to Sicily in general, rather than to these places specifically. So because of my sort of expert knowledge of Colhor, I can go into the interface and add these things in. So I'm not only reading off the data and looking at it in new ways, but I can also enrich the data through my interaction with these visualizations. I can do this for Sicily. I also know that, for instance, Tuscany only shows up in Colhor's entry as Tuscany, but of course there's much richer information there. So this not only lets me sort of add to the data myself as I'm working with my research, but I also sort of pull out similar trends to the ones Molly was talking about. So Ingemel's considers Sicily to only be Sicily, rather than these sort of individual cities within Sicily.
Though we're still working through many non-trivial technical hurdles, we continue to refine our thinking about the final look and feel of our interface. The tools we've built already are in a lot of ways revolutionary, even with these sort of hurdles that we still have to get over. But there are many ways that we feel scholars can already begin to use these tools. For example, if I were, let's say, interested in architects in mid-century Rome on the Grand Tour, their intellectual networks, the places they traveled, how long they tended to stay in Italy, I can simply go to the priestly interface, search by expertise for architects, and the individuals who are listed as architects are highlighted in the timeline. Just this simple snapshot of the distribution of architects in Rome through time is a thought-provoking way to think about this period of the Grand Tour. So we can already do some pretty cool things with this visualization as it stands, but our project remains very much a work of progress, in progress. Going forward, we intend to continue to add new features, such as expanded search functionality and improved user interfaces, as well as to enrich our data with person-to-person relationship information, and that will allow us to map interpersonal networks on the Grand Tour. We're going to add further geographical details for first-person accounts, such as the one that Sarah was talking about for Richard Colhor. And we're excited about the possibilities and challenges that lie ahead. And we enthusiastically welcome any comments, suggestions, ideas for ways that you would like to use this tool, ideally. And, of course, any critiques of what you've seen today. Thank you. Yes?
What happened to or at the University of Padua in 1730 to cause the registrations to lag
Wasn't that an interesting question? We've only gotten so far as the questions, and now we need an interested researcher to dig deeper from that point. Yes.
How did you two come to know each other and discover that you had these interests to share, A, and B, how can you do this and be a graduate student at the same time?
Well, to be honest, this is neither of our primary research focus. I do mostly 17th century German history of cultural exchange, and Sarah, as she said, is a classicist and archaeologist. But we came to this project for not mutual interests, but interests that are both linked to this. I did an undergrad thesis on the Grand Tour, and when I got to Stanford, I have to say this project literally fell in my lap because we had the beginnings of this Mapping the Republic of Letters project in the works, and our primary investigator for this project, who couldn't be with us today, Giovanna Cesarani in the classics department at Stanford, invited us to be a part of it. Do you have anything else you'd like to add about that?
Yeah, it's the sort of thing, I guess being at Stanford, these interdisciplinary projects that are sort of everywhere, and most people end up in one of them. I think, you know, the digital humanities is really exciting. And like, I think a lot of humanities work can be, you know, augmented by things like this, where you sort of look, of course you look at the data in a traditional sort of humanitarian way, but you can also sort of think about it in a sort of more social science way. I think all of these things really have a lot to add to the humanities, so I mean, I think we were both really excited about that potential.
Right.
In terms of having, how do we do it and be graduate students? I basically just don't sleep very much.
And has put off working on her dissertation.
Yeah, I quit working on my dissertation.
Yeah, and I'm interested generally in cultural exchange in the early modern period, and as we're developing these tools, the Grand Tour is a terrific example of a way that you can look at cultural exchange through travel. So we're not only developing tools to look specifically at this data source, and I even, as humanists, I think we always cringe a little bit by saying data with all of this great narrative information that we have. But the ideas that we're thinking about when turning traditional humanities data into digital humanities data, I think is something that all scholars should sort of have on their minds in the 21st century. Yes?
Is there do you think there's the possibility or the intent to actually go into the detail of what each person, for example, through diaries, looked at? Not just the people they met, but if you go to Rome, what are the objects, the buildings that people actually saw or wrote about seeing, to that kind of detail? So that you know that everybody went to see San Pietro and Vincoli, but you know, nobody went to see San Clemente. Who knows?
I think that sounds wonderful. That's something we haven't considered yet. That sounds fascinating. And there is, with the full text search, you can search for certain sites that you might want to see. And I think there are endless research questions that are possible for this tool. And the only way that the full the full potential of the tool can be realized is if individual scholars come to it with questions like that and sort of pull out those possibilities. Yes.
I want to ask about the data set. You start with Ingemells, and you know there's a certain kind of self-containedness to that. There are probably some travelers who aren't in there. And then you get the problems like the Register of Padova, and then you're adding things in like Cohor's individual stops in Sicily. Is the ideal to actually build up a data set that includes all data known to anyone eventually? Or is there something about sticking with Ingemells that, although it's limited, it's extensive, but it's nevertheless limited, does that give you greater, kind of, you know, in a scientific sense, greater control?
Well, I think the end goal for the project is to add more data and to sort of like get as much as possible in there, because obviously, you know, the more information there is better. But we also have been thinking a lot about the interface. And one of the big features we want to add is that it's all user sort of controlled. So I, as a user, can say, like, I would like to look at information from these sources. But you always know what you're looking at. So in that way, we can really aggregate all these sources from different places without sort of confusing or conflating sources of different, reliability level or, accuracy, completeness. So it's going to be all about you as the user going in and filtering out the things you want to see or don't want to see. Of course, that's probably very far down the road, as we still haven't even finished entering all the Ingemel's data itself. But yeah.
Instead of like M through S or something. I mean, the full text entries are there, but the pieces of information that we pull out and say explicitly, this is an expertise, this is a social status, this is a name, or even we have educational and social affiliations. So I saw someone tomorrow's presenting on the Academia Arcadia, and that's one of the institutional associations that will come up. I think you're right, Professor Harper, this is not an exhaustive set of data for the Grand Tour, and we are discussing whether or not to have this be an interface and a data input device that scholars all the time can continue to add to. And we haven't...
Sort of wiki Ingemel's.
It's sort of, yeah. And we haven't come to a conclusion about how to do that or whether or not to do that. If we want to say, this is Ingemel's data as it is, as it stands, which he also acknowledges not to be exhaustive, but to be a monumental resource in its own right. So that's still something we're thinking about.
It also does bring to mind, I think one of the fundamental problems we've been wrestling with too is these sort of tools that exist to display quantitative information. They seem very authoritative. They seem to say, like, here are the numbers. Like, it's the numbers, of course, so we trust them. But I mean, obviously in the humanities, this is not something that our material sort of feeds into very well. So the Ingemel's data is very, selective. So Ingemel's himself sort of chooses to include certain things or not. And there are things like the Padua register, which sort of wonk off a lot of statistics in certain ways. And we've really been wrestling with how to display uncertainty in methods which are not meant to sort of accommodate that at all. And this is really one of the fundamental problems of digital humanities in general. And we haven't really solved those problems yet, but it is a concern.
So we want to continue to respect the variability of humanities sources, but still be able to see them in a new way. It's a really tricky line to walk and something we struggle with, but we want to do in a very conscientious way so that everyone is aware of what the data does and does not provide to the researcher. The other thing I wanted to add about that is that Giovanni Cesarani and Sarah will be co-teaching a course in the winter semester at Stanford about the Grand Tour to undergrads who, as I think this is right, their final project, they will choose a traveler and map their specific tour, as Sarah did here, which she didn't go into this, but she got down to the road level on historic maps of Cold Horse trip, which is really impressive.